Okay, so next up we have Jenny Langenrickson-Rolling, and she is a professor in psychology at the University of South Alabama. She's also the director of the Gulf Coast Behavioral Health and Resilience Center over there. So she's going to talk to us a little bit about perceived resilience. It's all yours.
Thanks very much. Obviously, like everyone, I'm starting with a slide about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I want to make it a little personal. So in Alabama, we have 32 miles of white, pristine beaches that are, frankly, among the most beautiful in the world. And I've traveled a lot of places. All 32 miles of our beach were impacted by oil. And we also have a large commercial fishing enterprise, so our fishing enterprise was devastated. And basically, although people think of it as impacting the coast, it actually impacts the entire state of Alabama. And that's because the total impact of travel and tourism is about $4.2 billion a year to the state of Alabama, which those of you from New York and other places may not sound like a lot of money, but in Alabama, that's a huge part of our general fund. It's what funds our education system. It's what funds our healthcare system for health disparities. So loss of tourism income is actually a major concern for us. And because of that, our lawmakers struggle with whether to call things disaster, how much impact to really, talk about. Because if we continue to make it a disaster, then people aren't going to want to come to our state. They're not going to want to spend their money in our state. And so there's often a struggle, a push-pull when you have a disaster that happens at multiple levels across the economy. So understanding the economic impact, understanding the political impact, understanding different people's kind of perspectives and venues, I think is an important part for understanding how disasters are recovered from and responded to. Okay. I did want to say just a little bit about why I also think this disaster was a little bit different, because I honor Dwayne's conversation about we have learned a lot about disasters, and we don't need to keep reinventing the wheel and re-understanding what we already know. On the other hand, we're always in a changing world and a changing political spectrum, so understanding a particular disaster in its context is also really important. This disaster was important, as Katie Cherry mentioned, because it was a combined and additive impact. So we're already in an area that really is a disaster hotspot. I argue it's not really a spill. A spill is when you have one vessel and it runs into something and then things spill. This was actually an explosion, and then it was a gush. And the gush, part of the most difficult part maybe of the spill for people living here in the area is that there was 3 solid months almost of daily exposure to media about the spill. And solution after solution was tried to cap it, and people, I mean, they were having writing contests with, children were writing in, have you tried bubblegum, and put that there, and so there was sort of this desperate feel that was very long-lasting. And I am a psychologist. One of the things we know is that prolonged periods of uncertainty are actually one of the hallmarks of people having a more difficult time with stress and disaster. We also use dispersants, and while the evidence seems to be that that was a really wise decision and in fact mitigated harm, I think again it produced that unknown for people. And when you think about the unknown, that's really what's psychologically more disturbing. We like to feel we're in control or God's in control, and when we don't feel those two things, we get concerned. I think on the flip side, if you look at Exxon Valdez, which probably is the most close comparison we have in American culture, the litigation there was extensive, protracted, and ended up not really restoring people economically in any way, shape, or form. To, I think, BP's credit, they looked at that and said, we don't want to follow that we don't want to follow that example. And they actually really did a lot to try to resolve litigation quickly. That doesn't mean that we should not look at that factor, because in fact, litigation is a hallmark also of ongoing problems. Because every time you go to court, every time you make your claim, you're recalling and reliving not just the trauma, but why it personally hurt you. And you're actually wanting people to hear how bad that hurt was in order to get restored. It turns out that psychologically, although that makes sense, it's not actually a particularly healing process. So, you know, if you want to get over a trauma, involving yourself in extended litigation is not recommended. Okay, and then we have media impact like we've never had before on our politics, on our disasters, on virtually every aspect of our life. And I think that we could probably do a lot more to understand the impact of media. What we do know is that it affects children in ways that we haven't really taken into account. So children who have exposure over and over to something have more protracted impacts from those things. And a lot of times when adults are trying to get the news, they're not really thinking about who else is around listening. So we really need to maybe perhaps spend a little more time thinking about, if we want to recover and restore ourselves, can we, you know, control a little bit the amount of exposure that we're getting and what that exposure is. Certainly the restrictions around what can be shown in prime time have changed dramatically since when I was a small child. Okay. There are lots of models out there. The only reason to talk about Lincoln's model is that he really talked about how the impacts vary across a lot of different things. I really am a psychologist, so I tend to study psychological impacts, which fits nicely with everyone else who's been talking today. The other really important aspect, I think, of this model and some of the other models out there is that they're now really emphasizing both risk and protective factors. So the addition of positive psychology, the addition of religion, spirituality, meaning making has actually given us a lot more understanding of what people bring into situations that's not all to their detriment. Oops, there we go. I also want to say that I am a scientist, and I really appreciate Larissa and the work that they're doing at the Sea Grant to bring together the science around what we know. And they have actually pretty strict criteria in the sense that it has to be a peer-reviewed, published article, which as a scientist, that there's comfort in that. Because one of the things that we also know, and actually we did some work with Dwayne Gill in a telephone survey, is that people lose a lot of trust. And they've lost trust in some major institutions, including our political leaders, including our media, whether they're biased or unbiased, and to a certain extent they've lost trust in science. And so I think that we really have to think, you know, there's less scientists in the room here, we really have to think carefully about, you know, giving good caveats, but also telling what we do know. And Larissa's really spearheaded a great job of that, so I applaud her for that. That being said, I'm going to show you a few things that aren't yet published. Okay. Also want to tell you that the information I have comes from two different sources of work. One is from, I was part of the State Emergency Response Grant right after the spill. We actually did something pretty novel. Tony Spires here in the room. We joined with the Alabama Department of Mental Health in Alabama, and then we got similar pairings in Mississippi and Louisiana, and we got our state emergency response grants to work across the Gulf, which is not typical. They're called state emergency response grants for a reason. So we got a regional response, and that actually catapulted us into the Gulf Region Health Outreach Program, GR Hub, which I think Ayana is going to tell you about a little bit later. And in that project, we're now part of a quad-state consortium, so we brought on Florida to this group, and our job is to really build mental and behavioral health capacity. And I could say a lot about that, but I have no time. Okay, risk factors. The reason I bolded some things on this slide, there's obviously a lot of risk factors for negative impact. You've heard a lot of them already. I think it's really important to think about what's modifiable and what isn't. Let's spend our time working on things that we might actually impact versus things that are set and predetermined and very difficult to change. So I've highlighted things that I think are potentially things we can impact. Likewise, protective factors, what we haven't heard much about today is coping, and there's a huge literature around coping, which I think we should remember and draw upon, and some of the research that we've looked at still tells us the same old story, which is that problem-solving coping helps people, and avoidant coping does not help people. Pretty straightforward. So if you're trying to avoid the problem in a variety of ways, not think about it, drink, you know, whatever it is that you're doing to kind of numb yourself and not do it, that's not going to work out great for you. And if you go to the problem and try to figure it out and do some concrete steps like open a new school in a shopping mall, you're going to feel better. And that's really where volunteerism, I think, has a huge role to play. We haven't talked about sense of humor. I have a doctoral student who's doing work on sense of humor. And it is an important coping mechanism. It can be used badly. All of you know that some people have terrible senses of humor, but it actually is one of the things that we do as humans that's sort of unique. We share laughter with each other, and it builds social support, and actually improves our resilience and our mood. Flexibility, we've heard a little bit about, and then of course today is perceived resilience. So I'm focusing on resilience. I'm going to skip this. There's, you know, you've seen pretty pictures and heard words. What I'm going to do is actually, oh, look at that. It's my animated, nice. Okay. I'm going to tell you my take on resilience. So my take on resilience is that the literature is confusing because we actually have three different things that we're talking about at the same time. And if we could parse these out, we could separate them a little bit, we'd see that there are actually three components to resilience that are really important. First of all, some people talk about resilience as a trait. So resilient people are people that disaster happens to them, and they don't actually have that huge dip in functioning. They carry on. You know, in my family, we call it stoic, hardy. We're hardy stock. You know, that's what my family always says. We're hardy people. What does that mean? It means, you know, you can do a lot of crap to us, and we just trudge on. We still go to work. We still do our job. So hardiness, there's like a hardiness. And that, in the literature, is a part of what people talk about with resilience, that these people just don't get knocked off their game very easily. So there's some characteristics that go along with that I think are really important, and we can actually make people a little bit hardier, although it turns out that there are some personality variables that are highly genetic that make some people a little less hardy than others. Those people may need additional coping mechanisms. So we could actually tailor, if we're kind of looking at individuals, we could tailor a little bit our strategies if we understood both how hardy they are and the circumstances that they're in. Secondly, we tend to look at resilience as a process. So every time people say we're bouncing back, they're talking about resilience as the process of dipping down and shifting back up, bouncing back, right? And so that process, the time it takes to bounce back, so some of us, we bounce right back, some of us bounce right back, and some of us bounce, and then we come back. Those are three different kind of trajectories. And when we look now at PTSD, we see that a lot of people have that initial response, and there are different trajectories of recovery. Some people have that initial terrible response, and they keep high. There are people that are low. You know, they never have that response across time. Those are hardy people. Then we have people that are high and then dip down, and we have people who are low at the time of the trouble and go up. So we really have to understand how these processes play out over time. So I really like the work that looks at, okay, are the predictors at 12 months the same as they are at 5 years? Or at 5 years, are some other things coming into play? Let's really understand how this unfolds developmentally and also longitudinally. And then finally, resilience is also an outcome. So how do we know someone's resilient? They're resilient because they're still going to work, or they're resilient because they're back in their house. So we're using some sort of measure of what normal functioning looks like, and then we're labeling them as resilient because they got to that. Those are three really actually pretty different strategies for understanding resilience, and it's part of why the field is sort of confusing, personally, I think all three of them are actually necessary components. It's necessary to be pretty hardy, right? And when shit happens, and it will happen, sorry for the phone people, you do actually have to bounce back, right? And you have to get to some outcomes that are universally received. There's also something that I like to call Resilience Plus, and a lot of people think about it as Resilience Plus. Resilience Plus is when you bounce back, but you're stronger in some way. You know, I used to say I ran the Boston Marathon when I was in college, and for many years I said, I can do that. If I can do that, I can do anything, right? Then I had children, so then that revised it a little bit. But, you know, you have those experiences where it changes your core sense of yourself. Wow, I am stronger, more capable, more fit than I thought it could be. And that's a really important outcome because we actually want that for our community, but we want that for the individuals in our community too. Okay, so I think it's pretty obvious why I think understanding people's perceptions of resilience are relevant, and mostly I want to focus on the last one, which is we can actually teach it, we can enhance it. So we can actually impact people's resiliency. Therefore, understanding this is actually probably a pretty major component to making your community resilient, because communities, again, I'm a psychologist, are made up of individuals. And the more hardy your individuals are, the more likely they are to be able to carry out the functions of the community in a positive way. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the current study because that's what got me invited to this. How am I doing on time?
Like
5 minutes, okay. Okay, that should be fine. So we did a random digit dial telephone survey, and this was probably one of the last times you could actually do a telephone survey. I think, unfortunately, for many of us methodologists in the room, telephone surveys are very difficult to take place now. So we're kind of left with harder ways of getting good samples. But we did a random digit telephone survey, and because it was done by our local USA polling group, USA, for most of you, means the country, but for us it means, you know, the Harvard of the South, which is University of South Alabama, in case you didn't know that. Most of you think, when you hear LA, you think California. When we say LA, it means Lower Alabama, which is also very similar. So USA is our kind of home institution, and it's very well known. So when people get a phone call from USA, it actually is not such a foreign experience for them. So we did pretty well with our telephone survey. We got people from both counties, year apart. Okay, so then how do you measure resiliency, right? Well, given what I just told you, I will tell you that I run about, 10 or 15 studies on this. I've measured it a lot of different ways to kind of see how things look different. On a telephone survey, you're very limited. In my other life, I also work with patients. They're coming to a federally qualified health center. They have very low literacy. They have little time, and they're not particularly invested in science as an endeavor. So we try to measure things as quickly as possible, and there are now some 2-item resiliency measures. You kind of wonder if they're useful or not useful, but it turns out that you can get some interesting findings even with sort of very short items. I personally think it's really nice to have the qualitative data to come behind it that really does a better job of explicating things, but we used a very short measure of resiliency. We had PTSD symptoms, depressive symptoms, coping, all those kinds of things. So what we learned? Well, there were some surprises, and then there were a lot of things that are no surprise. And given all you've heard, most of what you're going to hear is no surprise. I thought it was surprising that 92% of the people on the telephone survey basically viewed themselves as resilient. And coming to understand that, so kind of going back and talking to people and kind of worrying, would it surprise you? I just asked people for 2 years, what surprised you to find out that 92% of people in Mobile and Baldwin say that they're resilient? And they're like, no, it's Lower Alabama. Alabama, we get hit with stuff all the time. We're hardy folks. We don't like to go to mental health therapists. We don't like to do stuff. So actually we're in a culture where even though we have a lot of disasters, we do tend to think of ourselves as pretty resilient and hardy. However, I think it's worth noting that men view themselves as more resilient than women, and I see that mean is wrong. And white participants view themselves as more resilient than African Americans. So again, there are health disparities, there are sociological factors that are really important components of how we understand ourselves in our culture, that even though they're not easily modifiable, they need to be acknowledged. Not surprisingly, no surprise, lack of perceived resilience was directly associated with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. So if you don't feel very resilient, you're also probably feeling mental health effects. Okay, so what do we learn? That all seems pretty straightforward. I think what, the highlight of this particular is that we actually put in a lot of other things that were really expected to explain the PTSD symptoms that people are experiencing, which were just the rates that have already been published and people have talked about today. And so we put in economic impact, we put in oil contact, we put in some of the just sort of standard, straightforward, yeah, these things should predict PTSD, and they all did. Experience with Hurricane Katrina did, economic impact did, financial impact did. Contact with the oil, all these things, if you look at it, groups that had contact with the oil versus those contact with the oil is probably one of the most, strong predictors, continuous predictors. I would say, if you want to figure out who has problems, it's people with contact with the oil, and probably people who did not have the experience to have had contact with the oil. So they were not well prepared or gloved or have those things taken. What's interesting though is that basically your self-reported resiliency adds to our understanding. So even when you stick all that other stuff in, it actually helps you know a little bit more about the person. So all these straightforward impacts aren't enough to totally explain. However, for those of you who are scientists in the room, you'll see that the variance that we're accounting for is very, very small. It's a little bitty. It's like, so, okay, so what else is, going on? I think, one of the things that we thought, I'm going to actually skip ahead to something because I have like a minute left, but I think that we're not actually accounting for everything in our models at once, right? And that's partly because we have such small groups of people and you put too much stuff in, you lose so many degrees of freedom, you're kind of, as scientists, we're trying to understand complex phenomena with a lot of limitations. But I think it gets back to what Ariane said about social support, and that we really need that over and over and over. Every paper, every person who stood up here today has said, we need social connectedness. We need to belong. We are pack animals. We don't like to think of ourselves maybe as animals, but we are, and we like to be in our pack. Kurt Vonnegut, those of you who are older will remember he talked about this all the time, Grant Spoon, so we don't even mind what pack we're in. We just need to be in a pack. So one of the big additions that I'm adding, and this is not meant for you to read, that's just meant for you to kind of be impressed in a sort of, sudden way, is that I think that one of the missing links is that our most central pack is our family. And so we are actually individuals who are nested in our family, who are nested in the community. And so when I've done now some work getting parents and families and kids that have been exposed to different disasters, in this case it was a tornado, and looked at what can we do to predict the kid's sense of resilience, what can we do to predict the parent's sense of resilience, and I modeled family interaction variables on this. I predicted 60 and 62% of kids, so kids' resilience is like 60%, parents' resilience is like 62% based on how their family is doing. So we had all this prediction over here, we got 7%, 1%, blah, blah, blah. But if we actually look at how individuals are doing, it really is reflected a lot by their primary pack. And much of the research has forgotten that. So basically, I think that we have to better understand what resilience is, right? I think we have to include the positive psychology features, which are important. I think we actually have to pool resources, so we're not just talking about Alabama, we're talking about Gulf region, and we're looking at things wide. I think we have to cross-reference disasters, which was done today, because I think we have shared things that we can learn, and we also can learn what's different. I think we have to look across time, which a lot of people are doing, trying to see what, how things unfold over time. And I think we really have to take that social support variable and sort of unpack it. And I'm suggesting that understanding your family in times of disaster and your family rituals and your shared experiences is actually something that's missing from our understanding at the current time. Thank you.